So one of the themes that you're going to hear is what are the drivers of the grid evolution. We talk about federal and state decarbonization goals. You'll hear later on from some of those non-policy drivers, but we are certainly ending a year in which the federal drive for climate policy, I think, has never been stronger. And we are really fortunate to have a representative from the White House here to talk about President Biden's climate agenda. And it's also a representative who knows a lot more about the grid than I think that, maybe even some of us in the room. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Special Assistant to the President for Climate Policy, John Rhodes. He works in the Office of Domestic Climate Policy. He, before that, was in state government in New York, so many of you may have run into him, either in his role as the chair of the Public Service Commission or as the CEO of NYSERDA. So he was, and if you think about what New York has been doing in terms of grid modernization, the Reforming the Energy Vision was one of the first true grid modernization proceedings that really looked at not just what the grid needs to look like, but what are the functions of the grid that policy is trying to, what is the outcome that we want the grid to deliver. I could go on and on with John's background. He brings more than 30 years of experience, so a few more than we have, but I am thrilled to introduce John. He's going to speak for a few minutes, and then we're going to do the same kind of format where I'll ask him some questions, and then we will take questions from the audience. So, John, I saw you before. There you are.
Sorry, I got myself to the wrong end of the room. Good morning. Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. And thank you, Karen, Gil, and Melissa for inviting me here to share some thoughts with all of you. My own agenda here is to invite you to work with us and for us to commit to working with you on federal actions and federal investments and regulatory reform that can advance the goal that I think we all have, which is a zero carbon electricity system, 100% by 2035. That's reliable, that's resilient to the weather that we know is getting more extreme, that is affordable and cost-effective for all Americans, and especially low-income Americans, while creating millions of jobs. That sounds like it's Goldilocks, everything great. The amazing thing is that it's actually possible. We just need to work to get there. And we need, as a federal government, to use every tool at our disposal to get there. We have to get this work done. And what are we doing? Well, under President Biden, for the first time, we've got a national climate advisor. And Gina McCarthy is, she's the first and only national climate advisor, but she's not your run-of-the-mill national climate advisor. She's really a terrific leader, and she leads the National Climate Task Force, which is a place where all federal agencies that touch climate get together to marshal a whole-of-government agenda. And let me sort of run through some of the goals, and if you know anything about them, you'll sort of realize how cross-agency-ish they are. 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Solar, wind, and geothermal projects on public lands. 100% clean energy for the federal consumer and federal facilities, while supporting Made in America, millions of American jobs, and environmental justice. And while we've been working on those priorities as an executive branch, we've also had a president who's been advancing a legislative agenda in Congress. And you all know about the major victory for Americans with the president's signing of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which includes historic investments in power infrastructure, $20 billion to protect against outages and promote reliability, a new transmission facilitation program, an expansion of the smart grid investment program, and grants for, I'll just call them local, but for state, local tribes, utilities to bolster the resilience of their existing infrastructure against the disruptive events like weather, storms, drought, fires, and the like. And it also invests in the future with billions of dollars in innovation and demonstration projects and bringing these new solutions to the market while creating the supply chain that we need. We've had COVID, we've had supply chain disruptions. None of us like that. But even before that, we knew we didn't have the supply chain that we needed. When you look at offshore wind in America and you look at offshore wind in Europe, it's cheap there because they've got a supply chain. It's getting cheap here because we're getting a supply chain, so you know that's coming. The bipartisan bill makes a huge down payment, but we want to go further. We know we need to go further. So we've got the Build Back Better Act, recently passed the House, which will do just that, including expanded tax credits for clean energy, utility scale, and residential, targeted investments for critical domestic supply chains and technologies, solar, batteries, advanced materials, support for the federal government to lead by example with its own federal procurement, and also the, I hope I have its current name right, the accelerator, or the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Fund, or the National Green Bank, but $29 billion to finance these kinds of solutions. And together, these two packages, these Biden packages, will reduce carbon emissions by over 1 billion tons by 2030. That's a gigaton. I've never said that before. I like that. While creating millions, at least $1.5 million, 1.5 million jobs a year. So that's the Biden investment package. And let's talk about what that might mean for this group. Because if that's going on, if those monies are, and authorities are going to flow, the end purpose is results on the ground, machines on a roof, in a home, on a rooftop, in a field, carbon reduction, energy savings, and the like. So how do we get from the money to the outcomes? Well, we need partners who are going to focus first on deployment of resilient solutions. We know we are having increasingly severe weather events. How do we and you protect against the impacts of those? Outage mitigation, restoration improvement, and the like. And how do we employ new technologies and integrate those in order to provide everything that comes with that? Resilience, situational awareness, recovery, sectionalization, all that sort of stuff. Second, how do we focus the innovation on the solutions that we need most? The new approaches to decarbonization, solutions that we sort of have in the field, but know we need better versions of, storage, load management, demand response, and advanced system management, all of which deliver flexibility, which has many virtues, but also can be the building block of the non-wired alternatives pathway that Allison was mentioning. Integration of these DERs and the like. Third, EVs. How do we and you make the smart investments that work for drivers and developers and the grid? And here I'm not so much worried about what the automotive OEMs are going to do. They seem to be doing a good job. Progress is good. They seem to be all in. But how is it that we create the charging infrastructure that delivers the fuel, if you will, that they need in a way that's cost effective for everybody, that works for the developers that have to put those things up, that works for the customers who are driving the cars, but it also has to work for the customers who are not driving the cars. And generally, if it could also deliver system benefits, why, that would be good too. While benefiting disadvantaged populations who may not naturally be top-of-the-line car owners, while delivering economic and public health benefits, pollution abatement and the like to all customers, while pushing the frontier. I think we're all thrilled by the progress in light-duty vehicles. We know that the next use cases are within reach, but let's keep going and push the frontier out. Fourth, planning and integration. How do we and you, and Allison, and Melissa and Karen talked about this, but this whole planning integration challenge is a big deal. And it's not just a regulatory act. It's coming up with the solutions and providing the transparency about the benefits and outcomes from those solutions that explain why this would be a good investment to make for the system. So figuring, that's a challenge, but it happens in other worlds too. Telecoms has done this. But how can we kind of figure out how to make smart investments in system planning and utility processes to optimize the deployment of the clean energy solutions at all levels, bulk down to distribution, down to grid edge. The federal government is putting billions of dollars to work. It's not enough. How do you go get the rest of the money? How do you fund? How do you raise capital? How do you finance? Maybe through a regulatory process, maybe through a market process, to deliver on that investment opportunity. Sixth, how do we and you together capture the prize of what I call the clean energy economy? We can build jobs, we can build facilities, we can build supply chains, and we should do that. That's good for the outcome, and that's good for all Americans. Finally, I think we've had several comments today. I know it's still morning about how the challenge is bigger than anything we've ever done before. We need partnership. Now, I know we all think we partner a lot, and it's true, and we're getting better at it. But making this whole project work is going to require partnership at a level of intensity and effectiveness that goes a little bit beyond what we've managed to pull off so far. The federal government is going to deliver a lot in terms of rulemakings and money and other government actions, and so are the leading states. They're going to deliver lots of money and intelligent, smart regulatory actions. But we also need the regulated entities to adjust their processes so that the outcomes get better and better. We need the non-regulated free market entities, the competitive companies, to factor this in, think about their whatever innovation, project pipeline development priorities and the like. That all has to work much more effectively if we're going to deliver on this. But it's possible. We've seen enormous strides. At least I have. I've been in this world for about 8 years now. And it's remarkable, the sea change in terms of levels of exchange of information, transparency, clarity about objectives, clarity about what one can do, what one can't do, clarity about whether, well, this is a good plan for company X, but not really good for anybody else. Why don't we do the thing that's good for everybody else? So it's all possible, and I invite you to do this. We're here to do our part, and we really need to make this work. This clean energy industry and the companies and entities in this room have been, the best representatives of the kind of work and progress of the clean energy that's possible in this sector. I want to thank you for the work you've already done, and then I want to hasten to kind of temper that thank you with it, but we need more. Ask. Your leadership is important in innovation, in investment, in job creation, and we're just looking forward to the partnership. And I'll add, partnership is not a natural act for any of us. We probably have some improvement to do, but we know we need to do it, and our commitment is to make it work. So that's my invitation. I've run through a bit of the agenda from our perspective, and I'd like to turn it over. Do I come over to you, Karen? I'll come over to you.
Well, I am not just saying this because you came from the White House and are sitting here, but we have been working, looking at what's been happening in the administration since day one, and are very excited about the focus on climate and on the grid. But often it seems like the conversation has been focused on new transmission, which our customers, or, our members are going to be customers of that new transmission, are developing that new transmission, are looking for ways to site and build that transmission. But our members are also very focused on the distribution side. And in fact, the distribution side is really going to be the foundation for a lot of the things in the president's priorities for decarbonizing the economy, things like beneficial electrification and distributed energy resources. So I'm wondering what the White House is thinking about in terms of working on the grid modernization side for the distribution side. And this is why it's so great that you're here, because you came from a state where you're very focused on both transmission and distribution.
So thank you. I think that's obviously, I think it's a very pertinent point. Let me just kind of go back in time a little bit. We did a power grid study in New York just before I left. And to me, the most salient fact that came out of that power grid study, and it's a study, and people can debate whether we got the math right, but I think we got it right, was that actually we were pretty good, in pretty good shape when it came to the backbone transmission system. We needed a couple more links, but those were already known and being developed. And it was really the sub-transmission issue that was the challenge. And that's before you even think about things like vehicle and building electrification, where you're not really talking about sub-transmission build-out, but you're really talking about distribution build-out. So we know that's needed. I think if you look at both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Build Back Better Act, you will see that there's a lot of money that is, I'll just call it available for those purposes. It's up to, I think it's fair to say that we need the partnership of the market actors and the state entities, including the regulatory commissions and the utilities that they regulate, to take advantage of that opportunity to make the investments that are as sensible for the future as possible. And again, I know that in a regulatory world, planning for a future that is coming, but you can't actually specify is hard. I mean, it's not something that, the procedures do well, but the federal government is making the resources available for the states to succeed at that. And I have great hope that some states will do a very good job of that. I'd love it if it were New York, but some states will figure this out very successfully, and that can be a model for carrying it forward. But I agree, we need more than just the iconic backbone new transmission build. We need it all.
Yeah. One of the themes that you'll hear here for those watching, and particularly those watching outside this room, is that, whether you agree or disagree with the president's policies on climate, or whether you are not a New York State or a California, that a lot of this is coming at you fast, whether you have a policy around decarbonization or not. And I think, we're going to hear from Google and Ford, which are, corporate procurement and the OEM targets for electrifying their product lines are two of the biggest drivers that are going to come at states, whether they want it to or not. So, the president's policies are aimed at rapidly accelerating that pace of vehicle electrification. And I'm wondering how we can all work together, if there's some operational things that we can do with the administration to smooth that transition, recognizing that there are different stakeholders that need to work together to synchronize those investments. And I think, we got the vehicle investments, you mentioned the charging investments, and there's the grid side investments, so that this transition is smoother. And I am wondering if you could also touch on the DOE task force was directed by Congress to be set up.
So there is a DOT task force. There is, in fact, a direction for a DOT office, which would have staff and a leader and do work. In fact, to deal precisely with those issues. I think there's $7.5 billion of funding in a couple of different packages, going to slightly different recipients. And the opportunity in making the rules, establishing the rules for those programs is, I think, really the highest leverage point for influencing how successful we collectively will be. There's been an enormous amount of stakeholder outreach. Sorry, that sounds government talky. There's been an enormous amount of engagement, both with stakeholders, but actually also with developers who are going to put their own money to work in this adventure to figure out what rules are going to be, are likely to be most helpful in getting this right, both in terms of getting a charging infrastructure that's actually useful for the drivers that we expect, assets that make sense in terms of having reasonable levels of utilization, a network that's kind of both dense packed so that it's kind of serves the local need, the short drive, but also has the backbone drive taken care of. Those are all tough questions, but having rules that sort of say this is the math fundamentally that we think you should want to see before you put the money to work, I think is a great opportunity for that. So that input season is not over, but it has been going on.
Mm-hmm. And we have a DOE workshop on Thursday afternoon where we're going to hear from them and talk to them about some of our ideas and questions about implementation. So,
perfect.
Yeah, we'll give you a readout on that. Well, I'd love to open the floor for questions, even though I have lots more in the back.
I'm Jessica Matlock. I'm with the Flood Electric Association, which is a cooperative in Southwest Colorado. And also some of my fellow CEOs in the room, we also created a new group called Next Generation Cooperative Alliance. Hopefully people heard me. So Jessica Matlock, cooperative from Southwest Colorado. And some of my fellow CEOs in the room just created a new group called Next Generation Cooperative Alliance. The reason we created this is exactly what you're talking about, is in rural communities we're finding that we need to be more involved in this. A lot of our coal plants are closing down, so how do we recreate jobs in those areas? And then build transmission, honestly, because we're starting to build larger generation renewables. So I'm just curious, how do you see the rural communities be involved? Because a lot of the low-income communities come to rural communities. We have disadvantaged communities. We have a large tribe in our area, and we're finding roadblocks to actually meet what you're talking about. It's pretty significant roadblocks in how we actually get to a clean economy. So I'm just curious, have you experienced that? Have you heard of these problems in rural communities? And what does the White House plan to do to help?
So yes, it's hard not to have heard about these issues. I think that my own view, or our view, is that co-ops have a special status in a couple of ways. One is that you're co-op, not an investor-owned utility, which I think puts you in a different and in some case more constrained economic situation, fewer options. And then, as you say, co-ops frequently, especially out west, are rural and low income, or more so than the customer base of whatever the average plain vanilla utility. And we need this this transition to work for all of them. So in part of our whole of government approach that I cited, we're working closely cross-agency, including USDA, which I think has a whole lot of relevance to many of the rural co-ops. And that's an agenda about helping them achieve the goals in terms of reinvesting in their systems. Adjacent to that is a focus on delivering for lower income, including rural lower income customers, including tribal. So there's a special requirement that 40% of the investments, or 40% of the benefits on the investments that we're making go to lower income households, including the rural side. And finally, I think you mentioned something that we tend to call energy communities, where you've got a community that has a fossil plant, stereotypically a coal plant that's going to transition down, and what do we do about that? Yes, from an energy electricity replacement perspective, but more importantly from a preservation of the economic opportunity infrastructure for that community. And that's also a focus both of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better Act. Do you need to talk to somebody about this? Okay, so I'm John.B, like boy,
here you go.
.Rhodes at who.eop. Please email me.
And I will say that the infrastructure package has specific carve-outs for small and medium utilities. So there is a and we were successful in advocating for that, because for the exact reason that you mentioned, which is that your projects are going to look different, your funding levels are going to look different, your needs will look different. So there will be special carve-outs. And as we talk to DOE and the other agencies about how they implement those programs, the rules are, it'll be very important to hear from your voices to make sure that those set-asides work for you. So do we have a virtual question? You held your hand up, but I think you were telling me that the time is up. Okay, let's take a virtual question.
Let's take one more in here.
Okay. We have one more question from the audience here. Go, Mark it. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, I'm Rasim Harris. I'm actually one of the very few guys coming from overseas. So I'm based in the UK. I represent Elia Group, one of the major European TSOs who participated as a co-founding partner in the famous backbone of the Atlantic offshore transmission 10 years ago alongside Google and Marubeni. I've worked a lot in offshore wind. I'm an offshore wind guy, especially in the transmission part. I've worked a lot in some of the iconic projects across Massachusetts and New York. You've mentioned the big ambitions of the US now in offshore wind with 3 gigawatt by 2030. I was just wondering what's your view in terms of grid coordination across the different states. We see now in Europe things being a little bit crowded, and new multi-purpose islands for connecting different offshore winds across different states. And because of the scale of the US and the ambitions for that and the local supply chain that will be set up, I was just wondering to get your view on that. Thank you.
So it's clear to us that there needs to be kind of a smart, purposeful approach to transmission of the offshore wind energy onto shore. I think we believe that there are two salient aspects to that. One is the actual injection point onto shore. Simply put, that's going to be precious real estate. There's only a certain number of places where it's going to make sense, and we should make sure that we're smart about making investments around those injection points that are not just one by one, but oriented towards a future of much larger scale. And then there's the question of, okay, what do we do out in the water? Do we want, a classic big bus bar that just kind of runs from, Maine down to Hatteras or less? Or do we want a different configuration? And that's being studied by DOE, but by others as well. It's an interesting but welcome complication that while we're studying that offshore in the water solution, wind farms are being deployed without that and ahead of that. And that's all to the good, of course, that we're going to have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035 already energized and operating. So obviously something to get right, obviously something to study deeply, obviously something to be extremely pragmatic about, both when it comes to what happens at the shoreline and what happens in the water.
Richie is our MC. All right. Well, thank you. Join me in thanking John for sharing the White House perspective.